Thank you all for joining us today for the Women in Medicine Navigating the Mid-Career Transition webinar. I'm one of the moderators, so my name is Filiz Korkmaz. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Iowa. I don't know if the other moderators want to introduce themselves.
Sure. I'm Erica Orsini. I am an early career physician scientist assistant professor at the Cleveland Clinic, and I'm excited today to introduce my mentor.
And I'm Lauren Eggert. I am a clinical assistant professor at Stanford University, where I'm the director of airways diseases, and excited to have all these fabulous women here today. So, Filiz, you want to go ahead with the introductions?
Yeah, so to introduce our panelists today, we have Dr. Bethany Moore, who is a professor of medicine and the chair of the microbiology and immunology department at the University of Michigan. We also have Rachel Scheraga, who is an associate professor, Dr. Scheraga, who is an associate professor at the Cleveland Clinic, and Dr. Nirupama Putcha, who's an associate professor at Johns Hopkins, joining us here today to talk to us about this important transition in our careers. So I don't know if anyone has anything else to add, but if not, then we can kind of start with, I guess, our first question is just, what does the mid-career mean to you?
We have three people from different parts of this transition. Maybe Dr. Moore, we can start with you as the full professor here and talk about a little bit about what the mid-career transition meant to you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, normally I think of mid-career as being sort of the, assistant to associate. But I think that probably other people can talk about that transition and maybe since I'm full, maybe I'll leave my comments. And if you want to, I can talk a little bit about the associate to full and how that's different. But I think mid-career is kind of a little bit about, mostly in that associate professor range, how do you get to that range? And then what do you think about what are the differences in what you need for promotion at the associate range versus what you need to go up to full, thinking about that. And then, probably in this audience, a little bit about what's different for those metrics, on the different tracks that are possible.
So I don't know if, Dr. Scheraga or Putcha want to kind of give us a little bit of insight on, the mid-career in the context of the assistant to associate professor transition and kind of how that differs also between, the clinical, so more clinical track versus PhD like basic science.
I guess I could go first. Here at the Cleveland Clinic's a little bit different than the university setting, so I think it's sort of good to compare and contrast. We don't have tenure here, so that's a little bit different. We have yearly contracts, and the benefit of such is that we get to have a little more oversight yearly with our leadership on, career goals. But I think that mid-career for me meant that I no longer, I had to run my own lab. I no longer had a sort of a mentor to run each individual experiments by. It was, more of a, global, put things together myself. You're no longer early stage, which was the saddest part about mid-career, I think. You no longer sort of get the extra benefit of like your first R01 and your first grants. It's more you're thrown into the wolves. Is sort of how I feel as mid-career. And you sort of explore, your own ideas. You can go in new directions, which is kind of, the good part, I think, for mid-career for me. And you get, you have to seek out additional support. So you don't have depending on where you are, a committee, that sort of is over your shoulder. It's more you're building teams, you're doing your own science. So that's the exciting part, I think, about the mid-career.
Yes, I'll add to that. Thanks, Rachel, because I think it's a really nice description. And I think, as you said, every institution's a little bit different with how they sort of define some people are, I think, more prescriptive about what is the qualification to move from assistant to associate, and is there a certain benchmark or a set of benchmarks? And I think, I guess it depends also on the track you're on. So for us at Johns Hopkins, if you're on sort of a research path, then that generally is do you have the equivalent of an R01 or some type of independent funding to be able to go up for associate professor? I think I can't speak to what that looks like for someone who's more on an educator or a clinician excellent track, because I think that's slightly different. But I know that for me that was carrying the first R01, and then I think beyond that it is having the right number of publications and so I think it's not just that, but it's already also always kind of told to me that was the benchmark people were looking for. I mean, I think, what does it mean to me? I do think, the implication of what Rachel's describing is it is being spread a little bit more thin, I think. I think that's what it kind of feels like on day to day, because the reality is for, a researcher who used to have a K award and have a lot of nice protected time, it does mean doing a larger breadth of research and different activities to sort of be active enough to sort of maintain your status as a researcher. So I think that's a little bit of, and I don't mean that to be negative, because I think there's some positive pieces to that, right? Is you are independent and you're no longer sort of running everything by one person. You're also not doing one thing. You're doing enough things that you have new avenues for collaboration, and you're sort of finding new things that are different ways and manifestations of your career building. So I do think that's a positive way to put it, is sort of building outward and upward a bit on your own with new directions and collaborations as well.
I mean, if I could add to that, I do think it's the hardest of the career stages, if you will, because when you are assistant professor or, instructor or whatever it is, these early career, there are a lot of, kind of early stage career grants and things that you can write for. So there's more little sources of smaller amounts of money that you can get. You're working in somebody else's lab that has, a lot of equipment that you can already go and use. And there's a lot of protected time and a lot of support systems that are already in place for you. And then all of a sudden you're not eligible for any of that. And you're usually, at least even in the basic sciences, sometimes your teaching and your committee service and things like that are a little bit protected for you as a junior faculty member. And then as soon as you hit associate professor, then you're expected to take on more service, and also that you can protect the time for somebody who's coming up behind you, and you're supposed to help mentor them and bring them along too. So I think that's a hard thing. So it really is that in-between stage. You no longer get the extra bonus points on your R01 application. Also, all of that does make it harder, and you're much more expected to be creating more of a niche for yourself that is, unique and different, and, competing against, labs that have a lot more resources than you do. So I do think it is the hardest time. I mean, I guess the good and bad side is that it's a stage that doesn't really have a time limit. I mean, that's the one thing about assistant professors, there are, the time limit can be 7 years or 10 years or whatever if you're on the tenure track. At least at the associate professor level, there's not necessarily a tenure clock if you're on there. Some people find that depressing, and some people find that comforting. You can get tenure after 5 years, and you can get tenure after 18 years if you need to. I actually liked that in some ways, because it took some pressure off of that. So I think that that's nice. But then the things that, you're thinking about to go to that next, if I want to talk about, what do you need to do at the associate stage to be able to think about what do you need to go for at that next stage. So to get from assistant to associate, what they're really looking for is sort of national recognition, or regional, at least, recognition. To go from associate to full, what they're really looking for is almost international recognition in some ways. And so the good thing is, like, something like ATS counts for that, which is very helpful in this regard. But they really want to start to see a lot more service. And so that's where you have to, as associate, what you have to do is start to take on more and more service, which is the other reason why associate is such a hard stage, because to get ready to go to full, you need to start taking on things like editorial boards. You need to start taking on grant review service. You need to start taking on service in your professional societies and all, because all of those are the things that give you the international recognition to be able to go to full, but you're still doing all of that while you're trying to mentor students, mentor trainees, still write papers and still do it. So it really is, it's a rat race at that stage. It really, truly is a rat race. And I think the thing that can make it helpful is if you can get a few really good key people who work with you who will help you work in the lab. And so like, hiring a really good technician or getting a great student or hiring a great postdoc, that can be life-saving for you at that stage. So your best investment is a really key personnel or 2 or 3 at that stage. That can be really helpful for you because you cannot do it all. Because all of the things you have to pick up as you're moving towards that international kind of recognition, those are the things that are important. So
A lot of you guys are alluding to this being an extremely challenging stage of your career. What advice do you think you would give your former self, or what are some things that people can do to kind of prepare to make this transition?
I think prioritizing a little bit and this is tough because you have to be, on some level, you have to say yes to a lot of things because that's the way that you, as Dr. Moore said, you're not getting international recognition without some service. But I think understanding the priorities and what are sort of higher priority and higher, and it doesn't have to be necessarily about payoff, but it's sort of the stuff that I think is more useful for you professionally, for your research niche, for your interest, and also like what makes you feel good on a day-to-day basis. I mean, it's hard to know going in, but maybe to have some sense of priorities would be helpful. I do think I can't speak for the others on this panel, but mid-career is tough, but it's not a period in which your mentors are gone. And so I do think that's the kind of stuff where I think that mentors are helpful in the mid-career stage, is like helping you to prioritize and make good decisions in the long term. And so recognizing that they're there and you should be continuing to meet, fairly frequently, just to have bigger picture discussions about stuff like that.
Yeah, Nira, I thought that was great. I mean, I think the knee-jerk thing, moving from assistant to associate, is to say yes to everything because you're feeling like, oh, that, I must be important because I'm asked to do, study section and, I'm asked to be, ATS program committee and, but the time is short. And I think my former self wished that I would have, like Dr. Moore said, like built a really strong team. I'm realizing the importance of, team dynamics and really having a group that's functional together. And I'm learning that through the years. Wish maybe when I was assistant and on my K, I, realized that a little bit more. I think the barriers are, you don't have the money, you don't have the resources. So it's difficult to build your own team and you're in someone else's lab. So maybe a little more, thoughtfulness on what I would need to the pieces together. And it was also during COVID when I was transitioning. And so it was really difficult hiring at that time. And so I came from another lab where I didn't even have like a pipette. And so, it was hard to sort of figure it all out in COVID. But I think building a really strong team is, I think, a really important thing that I had to learn, as I went. So I think that's really important as well. And saying yes and no to maybe the right things.
Well, maybe I'll just say 3 pieces of advice and then I'd like to answer this question. So the things that I wish I had done in retrospect is that I wish I had kept outstanding records of everything and the data. I wish I had printed every piece of data that we ever had and kept it in a notebook that I could go back and search. So if you're not good about keeping data, you will be surprised how many times I've gone back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years and found a piece of data that might help a paper in the future or whatever. So try to be really good about keeping good records about your data and keeping track of, how many mice, what were their ages, what were their sexes, all that kind of stuff that you really have that information. That's one thing. The other thing is, I don't know about you guys, but Michigan has changed CV programs about 5 times in my career here, and it's impossible to keep up with all this stuff. So just you'd be surprised what you need to keep track of, but you really have to be able to document all this stuff. When you get ready to go up for promotion, you have to have the most ridiculous documentation of all kinds of things. And to be honest, I think it's almost worse on the clinical tracks and stuff of all these educational products and things that you've done. So really, you cannot over document all the things you've been involved in and all the teaching that you've done. So like every single time you give a guest lecture or you mentor somebody for a journal club presentation or what have you, if you can possibly send out a little survey afterward or have somebody write, a little note about it or whatever, that counts as an evaluation because they want quantitative stuff to be able to evaluate that. So anything you can do to kind of capture those things will help you put together those educational portfolios and things for promotion. So, if you have to keep a Google Doc or something that's a running doc that is not in the Word program, the CV program that will probably change 500 times in your career, to be able to remember all of the little things you do, you should just really try to get in the habit of making a list of everything you do so that you've got that documentation about all those things. Especially all the stuff you do for ATS. Every time you mentor somebody and sign up for something at ATS or you moderate a poster session, all of those things count. So, keeping track of all of that. And then the last thing is that you're going to need 5 to 10 letters. Actually, you're going to have to ask about 10 people to write letters for you. And these cannot be people that you've ever collaborated with. And that's hard to find, to be honest. So a letter writer for your promotion cannot be internal, and it has to be an arm's length letter. And it can't be anybody you've ever published a paper with. So that means you've got to go meet somebody who's sort of in your area, but you've never published a paper with to write these letters for you. That means you want these people you're going to meet at poster sessions and all at ATS or have been in an assembly with you at ATS to write your letters. And you need to start now cultivating those relationships. And so that's what ATS, frankly, is the very, very best thing about, is because I would have never, how would you ever meet those letters? And so somebody is so much more likely to say yes to writing a letter if, and theoretically, the candidate is not supposed to ask them to write the letters, but about half of medical schools still ask the candidate to reach out for the letters. If they can say, oh, yeah, I worked on program committee with that person or something, they are so much more helpful to do that. So those are the things that you really need ATS for, is to really just cultivate a few relationships so somebody will write a letter and they know you. And so if they have seen you and met you, then they are much more likely to do that. Now, I wanted to ask this question about, how can you navigate and try to optimize that transition away from your mentor? That is one of the more difficult things to do. And I was going to say this later about, talk about, to me, the biggest thing that you can do as a mentor when you reach the full professor stage, I can no longer get promoted any longer. The most important thing I can do is let my trainees be senior author. And that is not very common, actually. But that is the thing that I harp on. And so I hope that you will all pass it forward when you get to that stage. I can't let them be senior author on every single thing, but on a lot of things, and especially when they're trying to make their big paper. And so I think that's a conversation that you have to try to have with your mentor, is to try to let you be the senior author on stuff. So I guess one thing I would say is that, if you go to ATS and you're presenting the work, even if you've got a mentor who's been involved with it, I think people will know that you're the driver of the work if you're the one that's really presenting it. And so they may not think of, you may not have to differentiate yourself as much as you think you have to. It's not like, we all, like in lung fibrosis or whatever, it's not like somebody owns that field and there can't be 15 people working in that field. So, I certainly could have a mentee who writes another grant on macrophages and lung fibrosis, and, they could still be differentiating themselves from me by looking at a different molecule or a different cytokine or a different something like that. So But what can be great is if you can identify, a different molecule or a different collaborator, and your first grant can be a collaboration with somebody else that your mentor hasn't worked with before or something. That can be a really great way to start to stretch and do something different. I'll just give you an example. For my first grant, I had worked with Galen Taves, and I had worked on macrophages and fibrosis, and for a long time, and we were working on prostaglandins and fibrosis. But then I wanted to work in bone marrow transplantation. My first grant was on prostaglandins, but in bone marrow transplant. So what was new about that grant was bone marrow transplant, but prostaglandins was already something that I knew a lot. So that was how we differentiated, was I already knew all the methodology and the techniques on prostaglandins, but the bone marrow transplant was what was new. And so I had a new collaborator over there. So think about ways you can differentiate like that. Maybe that'll help.
Yeah, I don't know if I could comment on that.
Please.
I agree. I mean, I think that you don't want to overthink this too much. I think I was extremely concerned about the independent piece, how I could differentiate, but it's not a review criteria. And if it's mentioned, it's not allowed at NIH to say per se. I think that it's actually beneficial to have all the resources needed to, you're transitioning from a state where you don't have a lot of resources. You're on a K award and you're trying to get your first grant. So you want to capitalize on what's available. But at the same time, you could take, as Beth mentioned, like a little bit different angle and utilize the resources, sort of have like more of a synergistic effect. And, I put my K mentor on my first R1, and it wasn't thought of as negative. It was thought as positive because there was a part of the grant I still needed some assistance with for your first R1. So I think it's something to recognize, and it will happen to spread your wing. It might take a little bit beyond, your first R1 application, but it's something to just, capitalize on the strengths and not really think too much about, what's the line in the sand. And I really like the idea of having the mentees, start writing, at least be corresponding author on the paper that is for their first R1. So I'm definitely into that.
I guess building off this question about the mentor-mentee relationship, I still, as a assistant professor, even though I'm several years in now, still have the mentee mentality. At what point, and I think this kind of goes with the mid-career transition, did you feel like you were more comfortable in that mentor role rather than the mentee role, if you even do?
I would say it's not a switch. And there's some gradual nature to that. I also think for me, we have a pretty big group. So I think it starts out as being a co-mentor and then gradually sort of taking more accountability for some of those people you're co-mentoring. And then, gradually taking on your own mentees from the start. I do think, one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking, Lauren, was that there are, I found myself at times, like in the past several years, just reminding myself, like, oh, you don't need to ask about that. And I think there is a little bit of this reliance that you have when you're in that sort of mentored period. And then I think it takes, well, for me, it took being intentional about saying, okay, I don't need to ask anybody else. I'm just going to do this and we'll see what happens. And so I think you have to also create that, stop and ask yourself sometimes, because when you're in a pattern of, your mentee, some of this happens naturally, but some of it you have to force yourself to take on and be intentional about not being the mentee anymore. But I think it's gradual. I don't think there's a point where, I mean, I still am a mentee at times, right? But largely trying to be more of a mentor. And I think that process has unfolded in the past several years. So.
Yeah, I love that question. I think that, you want to balance when you want to do too much mentoring, because the transition is difficult and amongst itself. That was already highlighted, where you go from protected time to less protected time and more responsibility. So I think recognizing, I really like the idea of co-mentoring. That's sort of what I did to start. And I think on paper, that also looks nicer. You know, when your mentee gets their first K award, you don't want to, you know, if you never had a K awardee, it's difficult to be the primary or the only mentor on a K award. So it's sort of, the system requires this co-mentoring, and I think that really helps you sort of shift some responsibility. And then you can, you know, on paper and then reality could be two different things. And in reality, you can guide them more on a day-to-day basis, and make it like a, you know, symbiotic relationship where, you know, you help each other to sort of grow your program. So I think that you needed that and they need you. And so I think it's helpful in that sense. But I wouldn't take on too much mentoring because it's a lot of time. And I think you also have to think about what you need to grow your program. So I think that's a little bit of difficult balance.
Yeah, I would say for me that it's really changed a lot over the years. You know, my first graduate student I worked at the bench side by side with through her entire PhD. And, you know, now I rarely work at the bench. You know, I might go in and help with an experiment now and again. But now I have, you know, junior faculty under me who work at the bench day by day with my students in the lab now. So it's really changed over time a lot. And the other thing that's really, that I know now that I didn't know then, is that every single mentee is really, really different. So you really do have to kind of adjust your style to what those mentees need. Some mentees need to meet you every single week or maybe daily, and some mentees really only need to touch base with you. Some will be fine with email communications, some not, you know, so you have to kind of figure out what works. So the biggest thing is just to figure out how you're going to communicate effectively with each one, and what works. That's the key every time. And holding them accountable, making sure that when you do meet that you're seeing output, and you know, that you hold them accountable if you're not seeing output.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I'm in the learning stages of that right now, trying to figure out how to be a good mentor for everybody. So I guess to switch gears a little bit, so like what in terms of challenges, what unanticipated challenges did you face in your transition to mid-career or during your mid-career sort of phase that you could share with others?
Yes, I can go first. So I think it depends if you end up staying where you trained versus moving between, you know, during this transition. I think that if you move, you get, you know, a little more resources, but yet you have to build more your support system and kind of start over. So me in staying, I had to sort of figure out how I was going to get, you know, like the pipette, as I mentioned, and the freezer, and just like sort of the basic things that the K award doesn't really pay for. So I think sort of navigating, setting up my lab and setting up the team, I think was the thing that was maybe the most challenging, and team dynamics. And so I think in doing that, as well as writing grants and, you know, still wanting to, like Beth said, be at the bench, but, you know, it's difficult to do all that. I was doing my own experiments and all at the same time. So it's kind of a lot. So just sort of prioritizing what needs to happen, you know, when, and building the program, I think was the most challenging for me.
I would just add to what Rachel said, because I think everything resonates in what you said. I mean, I didn't move, so like you said, you don't get a lot for staying around, you know, so you have to, you know, cobble things together. But it will, the thing I didn't anticipate was the management of people. Not something that I'm good at, not something that I had practice in doing. I mean, I think in medical training, you learn to work as a senior resident or a fellow or intending on a clinical team. That's a very different framework than for me, I do clinical research. So having a clinical research team of people, and then even if it's a small team, which I have, a very small team, it's also very hard to do that. And then, we also, I think Rachel, probably similar to me, are making this transition during the pandemic. And people are changing a lot too during that time. And so I think and needs and childcare and expectation of work from home and all this kind of stuff was pretty challenging during the time. So I would say hopefully, people aren't having the same exact challenges because that was a unique time. But I do think I didn't really realize how much of that was going into being a PI. So.
Well, to segue, thank you guys so much for sharing the challenges of the mid-career transition. Could anyone comment on the unanticipated benefits or the really positive things that you guys have experienced or really appreciate about this time?
Well, I can share two things. So I will say one thing that happened for me here that was really, really nice is that at Michigan, there was a group of women who invited me into, we call ourselves the boss ladies, well before any of us were bosses of anything. And it's a group across a whole different departments and everything. It was just, when I first started at Michigan, I was only the second woman in pulmonary actually at that time in the faculty. But these were women from, different groups and we get together like every 6 or 8 weeks or whatever. It's literally like a wine and cheese group and it's like a safe place to bitch basically, and gripe. It's a safe place to talk about. It's kind of one of those groups that we go around and sort of like what's working well, what's not working well. And it's a group to ask other women, what have you tried? What have you not tried? It's a place where people have talked about, technicians that they were having trouble with or students that they were having trouble with and got, some advice about what worked then and what haven't worked. And that's turned out to be just a group that has been super helpful about all kinds of things. So if you don't have a group like that, man, I suggest starting one. That's been like a really powerful team for me and still a group that as I've moved up in leadership, I still, since they're not necessarily in my department, it's really helpful to just have somebody say like, what would you do if this happened, kind of thing. So that's been helpful. But by far the very best thing is for me personally is to see a student graduate. So, to have a PhD student defend is like watching your own kids do the best thing ever. So that is by far the greatest thing. Or to see, to have a pulmonary fellow, give a great talk at it. When David O'Dwyer got his K99R00, oh my gosh, I was so much more excited than he was, So those wins are few and far between, frankly, but they have to be so. What I always tell people, those things have to be the biggest celebrations because there's all kinds of crap, and all kinds of crises, especially now, and all kinds of grants and papers that don't get funded. So you just really have to celebrate those papers and those grants and those graduations and stuff. That's what makes it worth it.
Yeah, I think for me, the best thing has been collaborations. It's the opportunity to sort of explore new areas. As a junior early stage, you're just trying to get your, first paper, your first grant, but now you can collaborate with other people, be co-investigator on other grants and learn a lot about, your area. And so that to me, that has been the most fun. And also being able to, do other things and just try out, do I like other, maybe a little more administration or, what do I like and what I don't like. I think you have a little more opportunities to explore. But I do think that the best thing has been to still have mentors. I think you really need that, as you're navigating, even when you're supposed to be a mentor, you can still have mentors yourself that, whether you have a group like what Beth mentioned, or you at least know who to ask what, if you're having some trouble and you know don't want to react to it, it's good to have a safe space to talk about it. And because it, like was mentioned, we don't get training on how to really do any of this, and the people in in our clinical training were basically the same type of folk, and it's like they go through intern residency, it's a different group that you're working with. So I think people come from all over with different education, and it's just a different way to manage people. So it's always good to bounce ideas off before reacting and not immediately respond. That has really helped me as well.
Great. I think we're going to just quickly address the question. There was a question in the chat regarding how can one best learn to manage PRAs in a group as a late assistant or as an associate? I'm not 100% sure about the question, but if perhaps.
I messaged to find a professional research assistant.
So okay. That's what I don't know what that means.
So I will say, I think that depends. I can tell you that some, I've had different ways. A lot of times, so it kind of depends, because there are some research assistants who, like if they are trying to go to graduate school themselves or go to medical school, like they want a lot of independence in what they want to do and stuff. And so they may need a different. Then there are some who just want to be told what to do, and it's a 9-to-5 job for them and stuff. Both can work very, very well, and it just depends. I will say I have had I don't know if this is what the issue is for you, but the very best research assistant I ever had that was with me for 20 years and that I've never gotten over her leaving. For her, it was a 9-to-5 job, but she was technically excellent. And what worked best for her is I wrote out the experiment on a piece of paper. I put a number, experiment number 125 or whatever. I wrote it how many mice I wanted, what I wanted done to them, what experiment I wanted, what ELISAs I wanted done, or what PCR, genes I wanted to run. And then, she would do that and just staple it together and hand it back to me. And so writing out like that, it was perfect. And if she had questions, she would bring it back to me. So giving that kind of detailed instruction of exactly what I wanted done was perfect. And why did she leave? She retired, sadly. And so, and I have to admit, it's been hard to find anybody who has been able to replace her, because that kind of institutional knowledge about all the regulations and everything has been really impossible to replace. But she was the most important person in my lab, and the reason she was the best hire is because she trained everybody else that came after her, because the students come and go, the fellows come and go, but she trained everybody. She wasn't necessarily easy for everybody to get along with, because she liked it a certain way. And I would just tell everybody, I was like, you got to do it her way, because she's the one who's trained. So we're like getting, now we've kind of piecemealed it together and have different people do different things. But finding somebody who will be a long-term employee for you, to me, that was really, really helpful. And I'm positive made a difference in how I survived that mid-career transition, because she was so technically expert. That can be very hard to find today, but if you are lucky enough to find that, that was super helpful for me. And I have not been able to replace her since, and I would love to. But
yeah, I think that's I would agree that since people come from so many different backgrounds, you kind of have to understand what goals are, because there's always people who are wanting to write an abstract and get a publication because their timeline for example, going to med school or some other type of training is the long-term goal. But yeah, I mean, I'm currently looking for someone who will stick with me long-term. And I think one of the things with that is sort of understanding what it takes to find that person. You want somebody who has some experience and then can grow with you. And so like keeping in mind that that person needs a space to grow and like what their goals are that they're gonna. So for me as a clinical researcher, that's like a research manager, regulatory manager would be the goal for someone like that. And so I think just understanding motivations for people and trying to meet them, as a partner. So.
I certainly know people who've had wonderful experiences with, like, 2-year technicians really trying to get a great letter of recommendation for medical school or graduate school, and that has worked well too. So, and then having that person train the next person before they leave, so I've known labs that have done that successfully too. So,
All right. I think I will ask the last question and then we'll open it up to the audience. I think we're all, probably pretty excited, at least I am, that ATS will be starting 2 months from today. And I think some of you guys have already talked a little about how you're involved in ATS and how that works in the mid-career as you come mid-career. But I think just talking to our group, how has your involvement with ATS kind of changed over the course of your career? And for us assistant professors here, for Dr. Putcha and Dr. Scheraga, and for associate professors, for Dr. Moore, how can we best use ATS to our advantage, and what should we do to ATS to help us grow in our careers and make those transitions?
So I guess I could go first. Beth probably has a lot more experience than I, but I think I got in an early career group. That was so much fun. I was able to even chair the group, and just learning how to, interacting with the executive committee as the chair and getting the letters I needed for the transition. It was like everyone on that executive committee, as well as others that would come to my poster that I've met in the assembly. So I think without that, none of the transition or promotion would have been possible, because we just submit names, and I didn't even reach out to anybody for writing those letters. So it was really helpful to network, and also was involved. We were transitioning out of the meet and greets for the assembly. So we would do some kind of pre-assembly games, and, just hearing our names and seeing it's a little bit easier to network. So I think ATS has just been so helpful to me, and I don't feel like I would have been able to, do, from the science to the promotion without the connections I made. And there's even been some collaborations, for my first R1, I had one that came to my poster that was a co-investigator that really helped the grant. So it's just these serendipitous, sort of serendipity, sort of plan, because you're at the conference, but interactions that really helped me get started, and hopefully will maintain through the rest of my career.
I guess I think I had a similar experience to Rachel in that I had finding an assembly home, I think, is helpful. And I think it's that's not always as straightforward, because if you do TB research, I think it's probably more clear. But then some of us doing, for example, COPD clinical research, there's multiple possible homes that you could find, and so I think sometimes it does mean trying out a few assemblies and making, you can have a secondary assembly. So it's all good if you do that. I also got a fairly unique opportunity to be involved in the MECOR program, which has been, I think, my deepest engagement in ATS, both in a service aspect, because it's a lot of work and time, but also just from what I got from it professionally, both the feeling of contributing to something like MECOR, and then the networking. And like Rachel said, I think all of my letters for promotion that were the arm's length letters, they all came from MECOR. So I think that that was a great opportunity, but quite unique. I think just finding a place to start by getting involved, and then taking opportunities to do some kind of task, because I think it's usually service oriented, right? I think you have to put in a little bit of time to get back from ATS, that type of networking. And so I think but I would say find your assembly. It's a good step. And if you ever get an opportunity to join MECOR, which I think is becoming less common because programs are getting smaller, definitely take it because it's really, really unique.
Yeah, I got nothing to add. I really do think finding an assembly and getting involved in it, I agree. Try out a couple of them, see which one fits. Some of them are larger. Obviously, the smaller ones, there's maybe more opportunities, easier to get involved. But if you go to the business meeting, which I remember when my first ATS, my division chief told me, he said, "You're a PhD in a clinical division. You've got to come to the business meeting." And he said, "I don't care what you do, but before you leave there, you better volunteer for something." So I think my first volunteer was for an early career professional group of some kind. And then before I knew it, I think I served in almost every committee on the AAI assembly at some point in time. So once you get in there, you sort of keep getting involved and there are some committees that take a lot of time, like program, that's a big commitment, but there's a lot of them that don't take a lot of time. And it's maybe a phone call once a month or something. So, but you still get to meet a lot of people. And then to be honest, ATS is a whole lot more fun when you know a lot of people and then, you see them and then you go to these meetings and you run into people. It does make to be honest, ATS sometimes is more fun for the people than it is the science, because sometimes the science is hard to get to because there's so much happening all at one time. But the people aspect of ATS is, in my opinion, what the real value of ATS is. So the networking aspect of it is what is really the cream of the crop, in my opinion. The science is great too, but the networking aspects are really what it has, bar none, is excellent.
Well, thank you. That's great and very validating for what I tell my fellows every day, that you got to network, that you got to meet people. It's only about half what you know, it's half who you know. So or maybe even more. But I think from all of us, well, I guess let's see first before we finish if the audience has any other questions. We'll open it up. All right. Well, I think barring any other questions, we'll finish up. From all of us, we would like to thank all of our panelists so much for being here today. This was a wonderful discussion, I think very helpful for many. I know it was for me, so thank you again. And I don't know if my co-moderators have any last thoughts as well.
No, I just want to say thank you all for joining us today. It was a wonderful discussion. I think this topic is sometimes neglected, so I'm really happy we're able to get it together. So thank you.
Beyond 2 months.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for having.